So, system justification theory was a theory that originally kind of confused me a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily as straightforward as it seems. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain it in such a way that it makes sense to me. And hopefully, through that, it will make sense to you as well. So, I want you to think about the systems that we have in place in society. I'm talking about the social, economic, political systems. And do you think they are fair and just? Well, a lot of people don't necessarily think they're fair and just, but they try to justify those systems anyway. And that's kind of what system justification theory is getting at. I want you to imagine a scenario, and this is a scenario that has been posited by the original scholar who came up with system justification theory. So imagine that you are a low paid individual living in a capitalist country. So you may believe that your merit determines your value, and the amount of wealth that you accumulate is equal to how important you are to that society. Moreover, you may disagree with socialist values that could potentially benefit you being a poor person. And finally, you may also see the hierarchy that exists as beneficial to you. So, system justification theory is kind of getting at the why we believe all these things, even if they may be detrimental to us. In addition, people want to see the world as predictable because if it was not predictable, essentially there would be this feeling of a lack of control, and that could result in negative emotion. So, as such, we attempt to justify the systems that are in place, and we try to justify our existence and what's going on in our lives. So, people want to feel that current social, political, and economic systems are fair and just. Moreover, people will justify and defend the status quo in order to preserve these systems, even if these systems are detrimental to their in group. I think that's really essential. It's the people who are on the fringes, on the outside of these hierarchies, looking in, or on the lower echelons of society, who really attempt to justify the systems. They're the ones that need to justify the systems. If I'm a rich person, I don't necessarily care that the system isn't fair. But for a poor person, there is this need to believe that the system is fair and just. So I have one more example which I think will really help to clarify this particular theory before we get into how this theory relates to Me Too. And that example is provided by Kay and Joss from 2003. Essentially, what Kay and Joss did was they reminded people that poor people are happy and rich people are miserable, which may not even necessarily be true, as I'm sure you're aware. And then what they did was they measured people's participants' levels of system justification, and they found that the participants who were reminded this fact they scored higher on system justification. So essentially, they were more likely to believe that the current social, political, and economic systems in the country in which they were living, which in this case was America, were fair and just. So, we're about to talk about how this theory relates to Me Too and feminist movements more generally. However, before I do that, I have a question for you. Specifically, I'm going to frame this as a challenge question. So, what I'd like you to do is to pause the video, think about this, and then move on. I'll give you a couple seconds after I ask the question to pause the video. So, can you think of any other systems that we attempt to justify based on this particular theory? I don't think this is an overly complex question. However, I think it's important to think about. So, I'm going to give you a couple seconds to pause the video, think about it, and then move on to the next section. So now that I've introduced system justification theory to you and you've had some time to think about it, process it, and hopefully understand what it's all about, I'd like to talk about the first study that actually relates system justification theory back to the Me Too movement. And that study was conducted by Kenda et al., and it's from this year. There is one particular thing that I'd like to talk about first, though, and that is a statement that they make in their introductory paragraphs. Essentially, they say that people may be especially likely to want to maintain gender relations. Now, you'll notice that I've put an asterisk beside this, and that is because I fundamentally disagree with the rationale that they are providing. I think it is highly sexist. Moreover, I think it's highly problematic. And let me just explain some of the rationale that they cite to you. First, they say that gender status asymmetry is universally present and to that extent seems inevitable. Moreover, they say that there is a high interdependence between women and men because of reproductive needs, and that human societies create socioeconomic interdependence as well. And they basically say because of this interdependence and because gender hierarchies seem inevitable, harmonious gender relations ensue and there's no open conflict. And they say that gender relations are more likely to be maintained than, say, ethnic, racial, or religious differences. So I think this is highly problematic. I don't think we should ignore this. I'd like to know your thoughts at some point. If you could tell me what you guys think about this, maybe we can find some way to talk about it in class itself. And with that being said, I'm going to move into the results, but I want you to keep in mind that I think this article is slightly problematic. So I've already talked about one aspect of this paper that I'm not a big fan of, and we will get into another aspect of the paper that I'm not fond of either a little bit later. However, for right now, I'd like to talk about something that I actually like about this paper, and that is the samples and how they obtain those samples. Specifically, I want to bring back the idea of Henrik's weird people or weird samples. So, the idea that all the samples in psychological studies are the same. Well, this is a cross cultural study, but they don't use the traditional American demographic sample. Specifically, they looked at participants from Hungary, Germany, and Israel. Well, those still are countries that receive a lot of attention in psychological literature. They aren't America, so I think we need to just point out how that is kind of novel. It does address some of the issues that we've been talking about throughout this course, and it is important, and it does provide us with a non-American lens on this issue. So now that I've mentioned something that I like about this particular paper, let's get back into the aspects that I don't like about this particular paper. And that is the way in which system justification theory is measured. And it's measured using a Likert-based scale. I believe it's 7 items. And we've talked about how measuring attitudes is different than measuring behaviors. We read an article earlier in the course that was related to that. And I think that's really relevant. And it's also something that we'll talk about in a little bit when I introduce the next paper that I want to talk about on this particular issue. So, one of the issues I think is that they're just measuring attitudes. While attitudes are certainly important to measure and they do help us, they don't tell us as much as behaviors do. So now that I've talked about this paper at length for some time, I'm sure you're dying to know the results and what the authors found. And I think you'll be not shocked by what they found. Essentially, they found that people who scored lower in gender system justification scored higher in support for the Me Too movement. This isn't that surprising to me. In particular, it emphasizes how those who score lower on system justification don't believe that they have to justify the systems which are in place, and they're more willing to accept new systems or ways of thinking, such as the Me Too movement, which kind of serves as a threat to the current established gender hierarchy. There were also two particular mediators in this study. First off, women who saw the movement as empowering and empowering for women. That was associated with higher scores on support for Me Too and lower gender system justification. And for men, it was the same, but instead in terms of morality related needs. So if they saw it as an opportunity, if they saw the movement as an opportunity to improve their morality, they were more likely to score in these ways. But if they saw it as staining their morality or an attack against their morality, they scored lower on support for the Me Too movement and higher on gender system justification. So, with that being said, we're going to move into one other study which is relevant to this particular theory and feminist movements and the Me Too movement, and I think you'll find it even more interesting than this study. So, Young et al.'s paper, which is the next paper that I'm going to talk about regarding system justification theory, doesn't really deal with the Me Too movement. It more deals with feminist movements. However, the lessons that we take from this can be applied to the case study that is Me Too. It's particularly interesting, this exact article, because they approach system justification theory from a slightly different direction. Before I get into that, though, I'd like to just mention that this is a Canadian and an American sample that they're looking at. So a little bit of Canadian content, and they did 3 studies. I'm not really going to talk about the first study, but I am going to highlight the second and third study. And what was really interesting about this particular article was the fact that they manipulated levels of system justification and they also measured levels of system justification, albeit in 2 different studies. So, study 2 was the manipulation, and study 3 was a replication of study 2, only instead of manipulating levels of system justification, they measured individuals' inherent levels of system justification. With regard to measuring individuals' levels, it's the same as what I described earlier. It is a Likert-based scale, nothing too interesting. However, with regard to manipulating levels of system justification, it gets a little bit more interesting. Specifically, we're talking about having participants read a paper. You know, when you have to read something in an intro psych class for an experiment that it primes you for something else. So they either read an article which primed them to think about system justification or which was completely irrelevant. I believe it was on something to do with agriculture, which is kind of boring in my opinion. But the priming article kind of what the way it was described in the article was it reminded participants that their welfare is based on the systems that are currently in place. And this was supposed to make them high in system justification, at least temporarily. Before I get into the exact results, I'd just like to mention something, and I know this is going to sound like one of those podcast infomercial kind of things that you guys are probably used to by this point. So one of the studies, study 1, looked at Canadian university students. However, study 2 used Mechanical Turk. For those who don't know what Mechanical Turk is, it is a online resource that basically you pay them and then they pay participants small amounts of money to fill out surveys. So if you need a quick sample really fast, you can get pretty much any demographic sample you want really quickly. So again, not to just sound like an infomercial for Mechanical Turk, I am not being paid by them. I feel like that's every podcast person ever, but that's just something that I think it might be a nice little tip for some people. It's an option that's out there. So let's get into the results. Participants who scored higher in system justification disagreed more with feminist messages about relevant issues, gender issues. So that's a lot to unpackage. Let's look at it like this. So if you score higher in system justification, you disagree with issues relevant to gender provided by a feminist. So that's kind of the opposite, or not really the opposite. That's what we found. It's from the first study, the Kenda et al. Study, is consistent with this. However, these are kind of 2 ends of the polar spectrum. Let me phrase this a different way. Individuals who score low on system justification are more willing to accept and support movements like Me Too. Individuals who score higher on system justification are less willing to accept and support feminist movements like Me Too. So there are two little caveats I would like to talk about for this particular study that go along with the results, kind of. The first is that these results stood regardless of whether levels of system justification were manipulated to be high or were measured to be high. So individuals who were primed to think in ways that were consistent with system justification and individuals who naturally scored higher on levels of system justification were more likely to be opposed to feminist issues. So I think that's really interesting. The other aspect that is relevant is that this was not the case for messages from non feminists. So let's think about that for a second. Why would this be the case for messages provided by a feminist, but not for messages provided by a non feminist? And this was people who identified as feminists and non feminists. It was hypothetical situations given to the participants. They filled out a survey essentially. So I think, well, for starters, I'll give you a second to think about that. I hope you paused the video and were able to think about something. Essentially, what I want to point out is that feminists are kind of seen as, because they believe in gender parity, and gender parity isn't necessarily in line with the established hierarchical system, feminists may be seen as threats to that system. And that might be a reason why people who believe in system justification are more opposed to threats to their system. And like I said earlier, this was the case even for those in the in group who was being hurt by the system. So this was the case for both male and female participants. So I think that's really important as well and really interesting. Finally, I'd like to talk about something which I alluded to on the last slide, but I don't think I'm going to talk about it to the same extent that I originally might have led you to believe. That was that there are these behavioral measures. Now, Young et al. Didn't look at behavioral measures. They did manipulate levels of system justification, which is interesting because that isn't just using a scale. However, they didn't actually look at behavioral measures. They do address behavioral measures, albeit in a note in their particular paper, though. And basically, what they say is that behavioral measures or lack thereof might have implications with regard to results. And in particular, they say that the lack of an interaction effect in one particular instance might be the result of the fact that they're looking at attitudes and not behaviors. So Young et al. Really highlight how behaviors and measuring behaviors are important in psychological research. So now that I've talked about two particular studies that apply system justification theory to feminist movements and to Me Too, albeit not the second one exactly, I'm going to provide you with some key takeaways on system justification theory. First off, people feel the need to justify the systems around them. People want to feel that the systems around them are fair and just. People want to feel that life makes sense and that they aren't living in these systems that are awful, essentially. This occurs even if those systems are detrimental to someone. So, in groups that may be, so particular groups that may be hurt by a system, for example, women are hurt by gender hierarchical systems, and like poor people are hurt by capitalist systems, for example. They may still support those systems even if those systems hurt them. Now, let's look at this in terms of Me Too. Individuals who are high in system justification are less likely to endorse the Me Too movement. So, put another way, individuals who are low in system justification are more likely to endorse the Me Too movement. And that is precisely because the Me Too movement is seen as a threat to the status quo. The Me Too movement, while not a system, is a threat to the system, and people who feel the need to justify that system will be more opposed to movements that are trying to tear it apart, essentially. So, with that being said, you've made it through the first video. Congratulations. You can take a break now, do whatever you need to do to prepare yourself for the second video, and it'll be even more interesting and fun and engaging, I'm sure.